You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be with you as always. It's a little smoky in my neighborhood. We've got a fire burning down at a little mulch area by my house, and so, a little smoky. Not great. So, living with that. I mean, I love to smoke meats, so I mean, it's not that bad, but yeah. You know, it's a little different, but it's a rainy day. It's a good day. We're here to talk some football. We're here to talk a lot of things about Utah athletics. So let's jump into it. So today's episode, we're going to do a very brief NFL Combine preview that's taking place this week. We'll do a look at Utah athletic finances, and we'll continue the position breakdown for the rest of the offensive side of the ball. So we'll try to wrap that all up before we get closer to spring, and we'll move forward and we'll do defense. We'll break those down, in the next couple weeks. So we'll take care of that. So that's a little look at what we'll be taking care of today. But first, let me tell you about our partners at Canyon View Credit Union. Big dreams don't just belong in your imagination. At Canyon View Credit Union, we help turn those dreams into reality. From application to celebration, we're by your side every step of the way, because home isn't just a place, it's the people you share it with. At Canyon View Credit Union, flexible options and expert guidance help you create a home that's truly yours, the perfect place to gather and belong. Guiding you home, Canyon View Credit Union. To learn more details, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, a little bit of business to take care of here. I have started a new YouTube channel for this podcast called Utah Checkdown. So go ahead and subscribe to that, and get your podcast there. The reason I'm saying that is my plan is this year is to transition to a video podcast as well. So we'll do the regular audio. So if you're listening to this like normal on whatever platform you listen to, it'll continue there. But I want to open things up a little bit and do it on YouTube, try to get some more visual stuff, more elements on that. So go ahead and subscribe at Utah Checkdown, and we'll try to get some stuff there. So hopefully I can provide you that stuff. We're trying to get things expanding a little bit, and we'll kind of get a little bit more into the YouTube side of things. So we'll see how that goes. But I appreciate you all for listening, and for those who do subscribe to this on a regular basis. It really does help, just simply because, I don't want to sit here and talk into a microphone if nobody's listening. So that's really what it comes down to. I'm not getting any extra benefits from this or anything that way. It's just more, I want to make sure that I'm giving you guys the information that you want. And so if there's ever anything that, you want me to talk about, please let me know. I do appreciate those who do reach out and say things that they like or things that they dislike. I'm happy to honestly, do whatever is going to be beneficial for you as a Utah fan, or, whatever fan of a team you are. I want to make sure that I'm making this insightful for you and helping you understand the team that I cover, or the teams, with all of the athletics programs there. So there's that. Now, before we jump into NFL Combine, just a little side note. This last week, official visits started to come together for the University of Utah, a lot of other programs as well. But right now, Utah has already scheduled 12 official visits for the season. So that's May, June area. There may be some in March when Utah kicks off its spring camp. So March, April, you may get some of those. But as of right now, Utah has scheduled 12 visits, and it's pretty spread out amongst the different position groups for Utah. If you're interested, 2 wide receivers, 2 offensive linemen, 1 running back, and then on the defensive side, 2 defensive ends, 2 linebackers, 2 corners, and then 1 safety. So it's like I said, spread out. There's no real one position that Utah is keying in on right now. I haven't had a chance to really talk to any recruiting people right now to see what their main focus is for 2027. But I think, we're going to learn a lot more about how Morgan Scalley and his operation wants to kind of move about. Looking forward to kind of see how that goes. I don't see Utah steering too far away from what they've already done. They've had a proven model that has worked. They like to continue to bring guys in that they can develop. Obviously, you're trying to improve your recruiting rankings and trying to get higher tiered athletes. But at the same time, Utah has a strong history of being able to develop athletes, get them to where they need to be and, potentially move on to the NFL. So a good system that Utah's built. Like I said, I don't see a lot of that changing, especially because Morgan Scalley was a big component of that recruiting footprint. So I see a lot of similarities there, but we'll see what happens. This list usually expands to somewhere around 40 or more before it's all said and done. Obviously, as it gets closer, you start bringing in other guys that maybe were on the fence, and you get them in. Utah has a way of trying to lump in a lot of the locals in on one visit so that you can kind of get a lot of the same. A lot of these kids who have played together in the same visit, and maybe you sway some others. There's a method to the madness, so to speak, and I look forward to kind of getting more into that as it goes. So transitioning from recruiting to now the other end of that, where you take the recruits from the high school area to moving into the NFL. And this is a good week for Utah, where Utah has 5 players at the NFL Combine. These players were ones that you probably expected to be able to be there. But this whole week, it started on Monday, where, these players are going through interviews, they're getting their measurements, they're getting everything from the NFL perspective to kind of equalize it, instead of, the individual schools saying, oh, this guy's 6'4", when in reality he's 6'2". There's a lot of different things there to kind of equalize it, and then for them to test. And some of these players, especially some of the first rounders, may not test in certain areas. We'll see what happens. But it's an opportunity for all of these GMs and these talent evaluators to be able to say, you at least kind of put together a more finalized list of what their draft board looks like. And so this becomes a pivotal week for all of these players. As I mentioned, I believe a couple episodes ago, Utah was tied for second in the Big 12 for the amount of players going to the NFL Combine. And while it's not a guarantee that if you go to the Combine you get drafted, it's definitely far better for you, because now you're being put in front of a lot of different people. You can see how you test. It can go both ways, right? Where you have opportunities to grow and show these scouts what you can do, but it is also an opportunity where you can kind of hurt yourself too if things don't go right. So you mix that with pro days and some other stuff, and this is where it's at. So today is Wednesday that I'm recording this podcast. So Thursday is where the true drills take place, right? Where the 40s and the cone drills and the different things that way, the bench press, that kind of stuff, all that stuff starts taking place. And so the testing drills start on Thursday for the place kickers, defensive linemen, and linebackers. So that includes 2 Utah players, Logan Fano and Lander Barton. Both of these guys, I'm really fascinated to see where they end up, if they get drafted at all. I think they're more late round, third day type talent, but there could be potential where somebody takes a flyer on either one of them. I'm curious to see how that goes. Logan is a little bit older, has had some injury history that makes it a little tough for him. Lander, he was also injured, that kind of sidelined him a little bit, that made it tough for him to showcase his full potential. But he's also had 2 brothers that have played long time in the league, and so maybe there's some benefit that he gets there, a little benefit of the doubt that goes there. The NFL, people that grade these, put both of these guys as, quote, average backup or special teamers, with Logan Fano maybe as a potential traits or talent to be above average backup. So looking at there's potential there. I think, you look at where these guys are at and the opportunities that are ahead of them. They have the opportunity to be drafted, but that's definitely far from a guarantee with either one of these, based on where they may be projected, and it's hard to fully cement that, especially in these later rounds. There may be a potential where they go as an undrafted free agent, and that often can be a better landing spot for these players. The contract isn't necessarily all that different, plus you get to pick an organization where you want to go. So if it's 5th, 6th, 7th round, usually 6th, 7th round, you kind of play that game of, do I really want to be drafted versus do I want to come in as an undrafted free agent? And there's no guarantees either way. So it's not like being drafted over being a free agent necessarily guarantees you a spot. It really just gets your foot in the door if you're drafted, obviously, and then as an undrafted free agent, you get an opportunity to pick where you want to be. So there's benefits to each. I'd love to get an NFL scout or agent on here to be able to talk about this. We'll see what we can do, but this is mostly related to college, so we'll see what we can do and we can get there. But those two will start their drills, like I said, tomorrow, starting at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. So if you're interested in watching that on NFL Network, ESPN, those types of things, you can watch that and see how they go. Then there's Friday is the tight ends and defensive backs. So that includes Dallin Bentley. Bentley is another one of those that is being graded as an average backup or special teamer. He's a guy that obviously just doesn't have a lot of tape simply because of an injury history, plus his junior season clearly was Utah's just, terrible situation with quarterback play that just didn't work out. And so there really wasn't a lot of tape for him except for last year. And clearly he put a lot of good tape out there last year, but there's just not a lot. One more year of the success that he had last year, I think, would have risen his stock in the draft, though he's an older player, and so there's going to be a limit to what he has. But I'm really fascinated to see where Dallin goes because I think he's got a lot of potential ahead of him. He can be, in the ground type tight end, but he's also fits a lot of these NFL systems, which are much more open to a pass catching tight end. So, I think there's opportunities here for him to be able to get, a chance. I think he's kind of in a similar spot to Logan Fano and Lander Barton. And so it really is just a team, taking a flyer on him. I'm curious to see if he tests in the 40, what kind of things that he does there. Does that help him? What kind of little things will give him an edge? But right now, it's a similar situation to those two where he's going to be fighting for a draft spot, fighting for a position like anybody else is, but maybe a little bit higher climb to get there, especially as he fights his age, as he fights, not having a ton of tape. Saturday is the QBs, wide receivers, and running backs, and Utah doesn't have any players there, so we'll skip over that. And then lastly is Sunday, which is the offensive line, and this is obviously going to be the cream of the crop for Utah with Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu. Both of these guys are expected to go in the first round, which is a good opportunity for Utah, which I'm trying to remember if there is a time. I should have done more research on this. I haven't gotten into the real NFL draft stuff yet. But I'm trying to remember if there has been a year where Utah's had two players or multiple players drafted in the first round. I'm sure there has been, and if I'm missing up on that, I apologize. I'll get into that later. But either way, the fact that you can have two offensive linemen who knew that there was going to be pressure on them coming into the season, who knew that they were going to be evaluated as first-round talents and still delivered, kind of shows, where they're at. Spencer Fano, the latest grades have him easily in the top 10. A lot have him top 5, most probably around 5 or 6 right now. Good spot for him, obviously. Depending on what team you can get to, that can be a great thing, or it can be a bit of a slog fest, and you don't really know what kind of organization you're getting. I believe some of the latest projections have him going to the Giants, which, as a Cowboys fan, I hate to say this, but I think going to the Giants would be a phenomenal spot for Spencer Fano. I think they've got a great core moving forward. Obviously, if he can get in there and be a part of that, this could be a Giants team that is really dangerous and has a lot of upside with an organization that is traditionally much better than a lot of these teams up at the top. They've clearly won Super Bowls recently, so it's not like there's this big issue there where they just are not a team that wins. So Fano is going to be really interesting to see where he kind of tests this week and what he does. Obviously, we've seen what he did at the collegiate level, and he was phenomenal there. The grades for him say he will, quote, become good starter within 2 years. So he's expected to be a starter. That's one of the top grades that you can get. I mean, it's not... There's very few players that they're just instantly projecting of like, you're going to start immediately because it's the NFL, right? And I think this is a good spot for Fano who, whether he starts this year or next year, I think there's a lot of upside for him in being able to get there. Now, Caleb Lomu, he's going to be interesting because he's a little bit more of later round of the first round. And so it's kind of been hard to tab where he's at. There's, I think there's a lot of things that people love about him, and there's a much higher upside in a lot of respects for Caleb over Spencer. At least that's what many people think. but he's still a little bit more raw according to the scouts and everything that way. So they list him as a, quote, will eventually be plus starter. So I think they see obviously potential in him. It's just a matter of where he goes. The benefit for him is if he goes in those later round or in the later part of the first round, you're generally with teams that have a good chemistry, good organization. They're winning. And so this is not necessarily a bad opportunity for him because he's going to be in a good situation where even if he doesn't start that first year, he's going to be able to get a good opportunity to learn from veterans who clearly have done well enough to be able to be in the system and do well. So that's kind of where we're at. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but, looking forward to see how these guys test this week. And, depending on what happens this week, we may do a very brief recap of that next week and kind of highlight what's going on there and do that. Let's move over to Utah athletic finances. And quite honestly, I've been slacking on this one. I've had the data for a month and meant to do something with it, but this felt like the right time to do it. And so just looking at this, look, I understand people don't want to go through all the numbers, so I'm not going to go too crazy on this. And if I do, I apologize, if it's a little too much for you. But I think it's important to be able to see the state of where Utah athletics is, especially as they enter into this private equity deal. Now, as some context here, the last Utah athletics finances is not going to include revenue share. So, for example, this last fiscal year is July 1st, 2023 through June 30th, 2024. If you remember, rev share didn't take effect until July 1st, 2025. So you've got, and I said this, I said that wrong. July 1st, 2024 to June 30th, 2025. Then rev share took place July 1st, 2025. I was like, that sounds really weird. That's a long fiscal year. Anyways, so that's not going to include red share numbers. That's that 21 million number that the Utah Athletic Department has to pump in. So next year, we're really going to see the full impact that the university felt because of that. This is the last year where Utah was in the first year that the Utah was in the Big 12. And so there's going to be some differences there. Now, some context, the fiscal year before, so this is the last year of the Pac-12. If you remember right, there was some Comcast issues that all the schools had to pay back into. There was transition fees and all this other stuff to get into the Big 12. And so the university athletic department as a whole lost $17 million. Not a great situation. And, one of the rare opportunities, not an opportunity, but a rare situation where the university just quite honestly just didn't have the money that they needed to pay for what they did. Especially with those Comcast issues, they weren't expecting that. And so it became a challenge to suddenly have this big, loss of revenue that you were expected to get. So with that as the context to what this is, coming into this last fiscal year, so the first year of the Big 12, Utah made its all-time record revenue of $4.69 million. Now, look, this is couched. There's a lot of different things that kind of go into it. There's a lot of different things that can be paid for, facilities and other stuff that can kind of go on the athletic budget as well as, the university's budget. But either way, the university made $4.7 million if we're rounding up in revenue. So that's taking in all of their income, that's taking out all of their expenses, and then that's what they get. That's the most that they've ever had. In context, the fiscal year 2022, so really the 2021 athletic year, they made $3.8 million. So that was the next highest. The year after that was 1.8. Then there was the negative 17 million. So they definitely grew and they had a lot of opportunities there. The biggest news here is by sport, the football program brought in $101.8 million. In total revenue, they brought in $50 million. So take out the expenses there. They brought in $50 million, which is the most all time. The previous high was back in fiscal year 2023, where they brought in $92 million. And then in total 40 when you take out the expenses. So really solid season. And you take into effect or take into account the fact that Utah was terrible that year in football, and they made a ton of money, shows like there was a product there. They were getting distributions from the Big 12. They were getting a good amount of money that they just weren't getting in the Pac-12. And so that's a good opportunity for Utah, but obviously there's going to be things on the horizon, aka revenue sharing, that limits that. So, we're really fascinated to see what next year looks like. Looking at these numbers, knowing what that is, as the university is only making $4.7 million in revenue, now you take $21 million that was never there before. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that they're going to be significantly in the hole if they have to pay that $21 million every single year. You just don't have the revenue. Even if you average it out to 5, you're still $16 million short of what you need. You're more like those years in 2024 where you had the Comcast issue, that it's going to be a struggle. This is partially why Utah is operating with the private equity deal. They want to be able to utilize a lot of that to be able to offset the $21 million, plus then use that to be able to grow in other areas. So, for example, if and when this private equity deal gets settled, a lot of that revenue share number that the university is looking for will essentially be taken care of by PE. Then you don't have to worry about it. Now you can still operate your finances the same way in terms of getting that. So assuming that private equity deal takes away the $21 million, which will continue to go up each year, mind you, assuming that takes that away, now the department can still operate the same way that it's always been, with different restraints to some extent. But do you see why that private equity deal became so important? Because now you can take care of that rev share number, and now you can continue to operate your department the way that you have been doing it while still trying to grow. Obviously, there's going to be NIL components as part of that. There's going to be marketing components as part of this private equity deal. But all of this helps the university grow in being able to kind of get to a number that remains positive. We'll see what happens, right? Like we've talked about this, there's risks as part of private equity, but I think the way that Utah's done this, there is a higher probability that they can make it work, especially if there is, rumors that they are in conversations with the Big Ten, the upside that they come there, suddenly you become much more valuable because you have revenue that is consistent. You also then would get an upgrade in the Big Ten if you get that. Now, look, anybody that's, not a fan of Utah and just listening as a Big 12 fan, this isn't a shot at the Big 12. This is more just Utah trying to find a stable ground in the next iteration of what conference realignment or college sports looks like. And so the ultimate goal is, whether it's the Big Ten or whatever it may be, it's trying to get Utah in the most profitable era to be able to be sustainable, to be able to be competitive, and be able to move forward. Obviously, the Big 12 is a great fit for Utah in football. I think Utah, as much as, you can complain you don't get the USCs, you're not getting Oregons, you're not getting all those types of teams into Rice-Eccles Stadium, this becomes a competitive league where if Utah continues to do what it needs to and have the season like it had last year, you're always going to be in contention for the title. You're always going to be the top of the conference. There is the risk that if you move to the Big Ten, now you're just another fish in the pond and you could turn into Nebraska. Yeah, you're making money and you're sustainable and you're doing great, but in football, are you the premier product? And quite honestly, you're never going to be the premier product because you have Ohio State there. You've got Michigan. Indiana right now is on a run that's making that work. Oregon, USC, it's a tough challenge. And yes, Utah's competed with some of these schools in the past in the Pac-12. It's just a different ballgame. So it's not that Utah's necessarily saying, oh, we fit because we, are equivalent to Ohio State. No, it's more just trying to find the great landing spot. If you look at the gymnastics side of things, Big Ten would be a far upgrade from where they are in the Big 12, where there's just not really any competition for them. It's going to be an interesting conversation of how they move forward with that. And so it's tough there. Basketball, obviously a great conference. So, there's some give and take there. It's really just kind of getting, I went a little on a side tangent there, but it's really just getting Utah to its best opportunity available. So long story short of that, they're going to be in a big deficit next year because of this. This is an opportunity for the private equity to eliminate a lot of the rev share numbers, not eliminate, but consistently take care of that. So Utah's not consistently, 17 million in the hole. And now it allows the university to run positive. So All these other programs, men's basketball made its most revenue that it's made ever. It was $7.4 million, which is pretty impressive. Women's basketball and gymnastics were pretty similar to what they usually do. Both of these programs run in a net or a loss, just simply because it's expensive. A lot of these different things, they're not getting a lot of revenue. Even gymnastics, as much as they sell out the arena and they have a lot of interest and a lot of people come, it's expensive for gymnastics because the insurance for gymnastics is just simply higher. There's a lot more risk involved with injury. Not that there's not injuries, in football or men's and women's basketball, but you can understand when you're flipping and doing twists off of, 4-inch beams and whatever that may be, the chances of getting injured can grow significantly. So there's some aspects related to that make it happen. Travel, obviously, in there. So the overarching theme here with Utah Athletics finances is private equity is needed for them. This is why they're pushing so hard for that, or else they're going to be suffering, $15, $17, $18 million deficit every single year, and it's just impossible to run an athletic department that way. At that point, you start considering dropping sports. You have to have a certain limit to stay at the level that you're at, but do you try to mitigate some of that by dropping sports? This is a big issue for the university, and this is not alone for Utah, right? Many universities are going through this as well. Very few make even, the $5 million in revenue. Most are operating at a negative loss. Even some of these big programs like Ohio State or Michigan, they operate at a loss most of the time. There's a lot of issues in athletics, and yes, it's accounting things where you move this to this and yada yada yada. But by and large, this is why it's needed. So hopefully that explains it a little bit. You can go nerd out on that if you really want to and get into the nitty gritty of it. I have the data for you if you really want. But, that's kind of the overarching theme there and being able to make sure that it works. So let's transition to now the position breakdowns. We're going to go over the offensive line. We're going to go running back and wide receivers and the tight ends. So we're going to finish the offensive line. And really this is just kind of a look at what's coming into spring camp, kind of who the expected starters are, who the backups are, who are maybe some of the more depth guys that may come into this. But for the most part, this is kind of where it looks. And so coming into spring, the offensive line is going to be really interesting because you do have some veteran players, but you're going to get some guys that maybe have some potential. So starting at left tackle, Zaraway Williams, is kind of the odds-on favorite to start there. He's a veteran. He's been around for a long time, has done well with the team, but that's also the spot where Kelvin Obot most likely is slated to play. So if Kelvin Obot, the 5-star high school freshman, comes in and he lives it up, to me, that feels like his position. Now, anything with the offensive line, you're just trying to get the 5 best players. So that could mean shifting him to another position if it needs be. Maybe you shift him to the right side and you still put Zaraway Williams on the left, or vice versa, whatever that may be. It's really just trying to get the 5 there. But I think these two are going to be in contention for left tackle. I'd list them as both starters because I think you can even have both of them as kind of interchangeable. So we'll see what happens there. Is Kelvin Obot more like Spencer Fano, where he comes in as a freshman and starts? I think that's where it will be, but we'll see. Zaraway Williams, he's got decent grades from Pro Football Focus. He's best at pass blocking. He got an 85.4 grade. He had 150 snaps this year at left tackle. So he filled in for Caleb Lomu, did really well in what he did, and overall was okay, but there's still some growth that needs to take place there. But at least, at the very least, as a baseline, you've got some consistency there, a guy that's done it. Left guard, Solatoa Moiai, really solid player. He had several snaps last year. Pro Football Focus lists it more of like the tight end role, so he was a little bit more outside instead of guard. But this is a guy that has had a lot of snaps as a depth piece, still not to those high levels that Spencer Fano was at. So, for example, just looking at Fano's grades, his overall offensive grade was 84. His run blocking grade was an 80, and his pass blocking grade was an 81.5. Nobody on this team is anywhere near that outside. Zeraway Williams did have a higher pass blocking grade than Spencer, but for the most part, all of their overall grades are pretty low. And so some of that is just not getting a lot of the reps. Some of that is just they're not to the same level of players as Spencer Fano. Obviously, not many people are, but I think that's kind of some context there. So Moai is kind of my expected starter at left guard. I don't really see anybody taking him over right now. Things could change, but that's kind of that. At center, Alex Harrison is the tabbed starter there, but freshman, or he's not really a freshman, he's a sophomore. Isaiah Kemma, who's coming from Ohio State, could be tabbed in there as well. Kemma just doesn't have a ton of snaps under his belt. He only had 31 at Ohio State. Alex Harrison's been with the program a really long time, since 2020, or at least that was his recruiting class, return missionary type thing. But he's kind of the tabbed favorite there. So curious to see Harrison or Kemma there. This is the key position, because you've got to be able to have somebody that can snap the ball well. You've got to have somebody that can call out coverages and really be the vocal point for the offensive line, as well as Devin Dampier. People don't think about a lot of the times what the center's role is, and if you have a good center, that offensive line can gel and they can work really well together. And so this is going to be key, where who can fit that role the best. And I think either one of these guys are being tabbed as that option. So really curious to see there. That's going to be a battle that I think is going to be of top of mind for the offensive line in what they're going to do. Now, another starter right guard is going to be Keith Olson. He's had 295 snaps this last year, spent time at right tackle. He's played guard. He's played tight end. He's done a lot for Utah and has had really solid minutes in what he's done. There's obviously some growth opportunities there, and I think, putting him in the starting role will help him. He clearly showed up well in the Las Vegas Bowl. And so I think you can say there's things that you can build on from that, and clearly they had a good time there. But it's now taking that next step, right? It's great to be the fill-in guy and get your reps, but then it's being able to come in and do it on a consistent basis. Now, with that as context, even with the starting lineup that you had last year, which was really solid, their backups came in, they still had a similar streak as what that starting unit has. So, for example, the offensive line as a whole only gave up 1 sack last year. 1. That includes some of these backup guys who were filling in or giving guys a breather. It shows kind of to the level they were at. So, it may sound like they may not be there, but we'll see, right? Like, it's easy to say today in February that, this offensive line isn't going to take that much of a drop. No, it will. Like, it simply will, just simply because of who Utah had last year and the veteran leaders that they had. But I don't know that it's going to be such a huge drop-off that it's going to be as noticeable. But I'm curious to see how that goes in spring and what happens there. Now, right tackle, you can get in Soren Scheinfeld. He has had no snaps. He's a 2025 recruit, and so, a lot of untapped potential there. But then you get Cedric Jefferson from Montana State, who I think, tabbing him right now as kind of the odds-on favorite is probably okay. Has had experience at Montana State, a national championship winning team. But he's got to take it at the next level. But I think, that's going to be an interesting battle there. Are either one of those two the fit, or do you move, Kelvin or Zeraway over to right tackle, similar to how Spencer Fano moved from left tackle to right tackle, and it worked out for him? Those could be in the play. So those players are kind of the starting caliber players, in my opinion. They're the ones that should be in contention for that role. It's not as clear-cut as last year, where you had kind of your set 5. I'm really curious to see how this goes. I'm curious to see how Jordan Gross coaches them up, what his take is on these players and doing all that. The backups here, guys that could crack into that, but just, in my opinion, don't really they're not ready for it yet, or at least haven't shown that they're ready for it yet, is Roger Alderman, 2023 recruit. He's had 134 snaps at right guard and did okay, but he hasn't graded out as high as, Keith Olson, let's say, or Solatoa Moiai. So, there's potential there, but I see him as more of a depth piece. Isaiah Garcia, the poor guy has been injured basically his whole time. If he can get in there, there's clearly potential there. He came in as one of the higher rated recruits in 2024, but we just haven't seen anything from him because he's just always been injured. So if he can come into this and not have an injury and continue to improve, I think there's opportunities there, but I just don't know that we've seen enough or that Utah's even seen enough to really get him into the mix because of the injuries. So for now, backup guy. I wouldn't put him as kind of a deep backup where he's at the really bottom, but that's tentative because we don't really know what he is, right? Like, is he conditioned well? What's going to happen there? Reese Parmenter, left guard last year, had 84 snaps. Decent, right? Like, I think he's on the fringe where he could actually have some opportunities there. He's got decent grades for Utah, but I think Utah has better options available for him, but I think he's a guy that can step up and be there. Now, the deep backup, most of these are, incoming freshmen, guys that just haven't had any snaps in there yet. So Nick Hallock, 2025 recruiting class, Mills Asiata, who was supposed to come in last year, but is joining the team this year. What does he bring? And then you get 3 freshmen coming in, Rowdy Pierce, Moses Sparks Jr., and Matayali Benjamin. All 3 of those, it's tough to see them contribute, but we'll see, right? So that's kind of how your offensive line room looks. I think it's a good situation for Utah. I think they're in a good spot. They've got depth. They've got pieces that can work, but we'll see how they gel, right? And like I said, offensive line is really about just finding the best 5. So, I assume that that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 players that I listed. Those players who I've tabbed as kind of starter caliber, I think are going to be in the mix there, and it's really just finding the best 5 there. It could be shifting somebody. It could be moving Solitoa Moiai into center. I don't see that, but, you could move some of these players. It's Keith Olson in center or, shifting somebody out to guard. Those types of things can happen. So really curious to see, but I think those are kind of your 8 guys that are going to be in the mix for starter. Now, jumping to running back, this is not as much of a mystery. Some of these position groups obviously aren't as much of a mystery. You get Wayshawn Parker back. He's going to be your, definite starter. I'm really fascinated to see his growth this year because there was moments last year where he was the guy. But then there was moments where he was still splitting reps with Nakari Rogers. And it's not that Parker all the time was usurting himself to a point where it's like, nope, he has to be the guy. I think there's a reason Kyle Whittingham put that little mark on him that says, if you get 100 yards, I'll let you wear the pink sneakers or cleats. But I think they also limited him because he had a couple turnovers early on in the season. And that anybody that knows Kyle Whittingham knows that if you turn over the ball, you're going to have to earn it back. So there's some areas where I'm curious how much of that's Wayshawn, how much of that is the prior coaching staff kind of holding him back a little bit to kind of make him learn things. To that extent, he does need to improve in his run blocking, and that obviously is a pivotal situation for running backs. But really solid player, barely missed out on 1,000 rushing yards last year. They tried very hard in the Las Vegas Bowl to get him there. It just didn't work out. But this is a guy that had 6 touchdowns. I think he has so much more potential than that. I truly believe that he can be a 1,000-yard rusher as long as he stays healthy. I think you're going to see a lot more of the carries running through him. And this is kind of where Utah's going to go. But there are some other players on the roster that can kind of split some of those carries with him. It can't all be on Wayshawn. And with Kevin McGivern being a little bit more pass first minded, I'm curious to see how they utilize the run and in what formations and kind of what takes place. So I think if Utah can be more effective in the passing game and utilize that as kind of its bread and butter in terms of starting its offense, I think there's potential where Wayshawn can actually be a little bit better because he's not going to be the sole focus of that offense. Not that it was that way last year. I think Utah was much better at mixing things up, so it wasn't him. But at the same time, I think this is an opportunity where if things work well on the outside, Wayshawn has a lot more freedom and flexibility to kind of be the guy. That also opens it up for, Devin Dampier. It opens it up for Bird Ficklin, who I'm not including in there, but they're going to clearly be factored into the run game. And so, we'll see what happens. But Wayshawn is definitely going to be the guy. Now, backups, this one's going to be interesting to me because you bring in a young but proven-ish player in Steve Chavez Soto from San Jose State, who led the team in rushing last year with 448 yards, 7 touchdowns, has good grades all around. He's a really solid player. If Wayshawn can't be the guy, Steve Chavez Soto has proven that he can do it, right? And his grades are pretty high. He still has some improvement. He's a freshman. But I think if you can get those two as your 1-2 punch, that becomes a great opportunity for Utah to have another similar guy who can, give Wayshawn a breather. You have another guy that plays a little bit different, but they have, the potential to be able to move forward and work at a similar level. To me, Chavez Soto becomes a very fascinating player in this room. Does he become the primary backup? Does he split reps with Parker? Or are there other guys that come in that kind of take that? I'm putting Daniel Bray and LaMarcus Bell in as backup roles, but this is kind of TBD. I think Daniel Bray is still such a different player that he will be utilized in certain situations. I don't quite think he's a guy that you can still rely on to be kind of the guy. And especially since you have Parker and you have Chavez Soto that are ahead of him, so to speak. At least that's what it looks like. We'll see what happens in spring. I think Bray has potential, and obviously his speed is undeniable. And if you get him in open space, there's no touching him, right? He just has this shiftiness about him that he can make guys miss quickly. Can you factor him into this offense while still letting Wayshawn feast, right? I think you can, so I'm going to put him in as a backup role simply because I think he's going to be a featured player in that offense. I'm curious to see how he could benefit from a potentially better passing attack. If that works, I think this room becomes much more effective than it was last year, which sounds crazy because they broke a single season record for rushing. I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think they can be more effective in the sense that they're not going to be the primary focus, and so it's much easier to kind of work out of the backfield where you can kind of catch the defenses by surprise. So that's, to me, kind of where they utilize him. LaMarcus Bell becomes an interesting player because he's obviously a highly touted freshman that's coming in. They love what he can bring. Can he usurp any one of these players to get in there? I don't think he's necessarily going to overtake Wayshawn, but if he's talented and he's consistent and he doesn't turn over the ball, I absolutely see him as being a potential backup to Parker. We'll see. I've heard good things about him and what he's done. Utah really loved him and thought he could be kind of this bruising back that can really help the team, but you've got to see it on the field. And so once spring gets here and they're going full tilt, they're doing practices right now. So let's not pretend like they're not doing it. They're not evaluating these guys right now. But once they get into the official full spring practices where they can go into the individualized teamwork and do stuff like that, I'm really fascinated to see how Bell progresses if he does. But either way, I think there's some good depth here. I think Utah's in a good spot at running back and being able to move forward. So good opportunities for Utah. Let's shift over to wide receiver. Now this one is fascinating to me because obviously you bring in a pair of transfers from the Mountain West who are solid producers. And so you're pairing that with guys that are returning who near the end of the season were being effective in what they do. So curious to see how this all gels, but from what I've heard and kind of what I've seen on the field just from last year, my expectation for your 3 starters on the field, assuming that this is kind of how they operate, I don't know if Kevin McGiven wants to go 4 wide, what that looks like and kind of who fits in that. But what I'm just going to go with the 3 main starters right here in being Braden Pagan being your X receiver. He's not your prototypical X in the sense that he's going to be the guy that is, get the 50-50 balls downfield. He can do that, but that's not his forte. He's much more of an intermediate type route. He can still get the deep ball, but he's not going to be your, lights out, blazing speed type guy. He's much more, I would say, like a Ryan Davis. and that was obviously effective for Utah, but I still think with his ability and what he's done, he becomes the X receiver, the wide receiver one, to be able to help that. And this is a guy that had 926 yards last year, 5 touchdowns on 60 catches for, led Utah State. Good grades from Pro Football Focus, could improve, but overall good grades. The best thing there, though, is his drop rate is not that high. He actually has great grades at drop rate, and so if you throw it his way, he's going to catch it. Once again, think Ryan Davis, but a little bit more production. Not much, because Ryan actually got a ton of production and he got injured and, whatever. But I think Braden Pagan is obviously going to be your top guy. He's developing a chemistry with Devin Dampier right now. I've seen many pictures with these two together. They're spending time together, and if they can build that relationship, I think this becomes a great marriage in kind of what Utah wants to do. He obviously understands Kevin McGivern's offense, and so there's not going to be a lot of changes for him. And the vernacular and the different things, the play calls are very similar to what Jason Beck ran in terms of the play calls and different things that way and how they approach it. I think this becomes a great opportunity for them. Now, Larry Simmons, I think, is going to be your other outside receiver. I see him as taking a big step this year. Near the end of the season, he obviously became a very solid player for Utah. Only finished with 280 yards, but he had 6 touchdowns. So that's more than Pagan. He averaged 18.7 yards per catch. So he's a guy that can kind of do it all. Obviously has those toe-tapping catches. There you go. I can speak. On only 15 catches. So this is a guy that, really solid. He's the leading returner from Utah last year. All the other guys have left the program or graduated. And so, he's the guy that I've heard a lot of good praise for, that he's going to have a lot of eyes on him coming into spring and then into fall. I think we're going to see a really, upgraded season from him. And I think his chemistry with Devin Dampier is already there. So that forms a great opportunity for Utah. Then there's Kyrie Scholes, who will work more in the slot from San Jose State, was the team's second leading receiver, with 768 yards and 2 touchdowns. Another great asset for Utah, experienced guy, did it at a high level, was effective in what he did. His grades aren't as high as Pagan's, or it's actually a little lower than Simmons, but this is a guy that's been effective in what he's done. And I think you can see an opportunity where he can kind of take that next step and move forward as a featured receiver in this game. I'm really fascinated to kind of see how these three can work together. It's obviously going to be more than these three, but these are going to be my primary starters here. And I think that's a good core to build around. If you can get those three producing, I think Utah's going to be in a really good situation. Now, behind that, as your backups, these are my main three. You're going to have Tobias Merriweather. I think there's potential for him. Now, clearly there was a disappointment last year in the amount of drops that he had. He wasn't connected with Devin Dampier. They, were not on the same page, whether it be running the right routes or catching whatever it needs to be in the right spot. Like there wasn't a lot of chemistry between those two. I have to imagine that changes this year. I also think that a new wide receiver coach who had a lot of success with Devon Vele and being able to take him to the next level, I think that can potentially help Tobias Merriweather. But at the same time, Merriweather has to be the one that does it, right? And so he can be that wide receiver one. He has that talent if he can kind of live up to that potential. We've just never seen that. Not at Utah, not at his previous stops. This is the time where he has to kind of showcase that. And if Utah can get, anything out of him, really, I mean, that sounds like such a low bar, but I think if you can get, some consistent yardage out of him, I think he becomes a viable asset where maybe he becomes more of your downfield threat. He becomes the 50-50 ball guy. Then you can utilize some of these other players in different situations. Maybe you get the 4 out wide. Maybe you get, whatever it may be. I think he can become a central figure to the team, but there's a much higher bar to get there, right? I don't think he's there yet, and I think there's going to be a ton of offseason work that needs to take place for him to get there. But I think if he can do that work and put it in, I think he's got the right coaching staff. I think he's got the potential there where the focus isn't going to be on him, where it has to be, we need to hit on Tobias Merriweather. He can kind of have a little bit more of an eased approach to it while still knowing that he has to bust his butt to get there. Next is two players that have been on the roster for a bit. Creed Whittemore really started to come along at the end of the season. We didn't get to see a ton from him, only had 92 yards, but I think you were starting to see pieces come together. Early on, Kyle Whittingham had talked about that he had a lot of drops in camp. That really limited his ability to see the field. Once again, anything that you hear from Kyle Whittingham, if you drop things or you fumble the ball, you're not going to see the field. I'm curious to see how they approach that with Morgan Scalley and what this offensive coaching staff focuses on. I think Creed can be a great fit for this team, and I think he can be another great option for Utah to be able to continue to move forward, but still needs to take the next steps there. Has a connection with his wide receiver coach, and so that's a great opportunity for him to be able to move forward and kind of have that understanding already. Then there's Dadrian Zipperer. Coming into last year, there was a lot of talk that he could potentially be wide receiver one. He's got that speed. If you can get him on the outside and be that deep threat guy, Dadrian's going to be a great opportunity for you. He's kind of the Money Parks type guy, gets downfield quickly. You could utilize him in a lot of different ways. The problem is he's coming off of an injury. We'll see what happens. I understand he's going to be participating in spring this year, although in a much more limited fashion. Can he take the steps necessary to get there? Will his injury limit him? Where can he be going into fall to be that guy? If he can be that guy, I think Utah has 5 to 6 solid players that allow them to kind of do what they need to. This isn't like last year where you were hoping to hit on a few players. This is much more consistent and cemented. They still have to improve, right? They still have to be a good unit, and Devin Dampier has to be able to see them. He's got to be able to get them the ball. Like, all of this has to work, but I think going into this season, you've got to feel much more optimistic about where Utah is in the passing and catch, the receiving game than going into last year. And with Kevin McGivern being a pass-first-minded coach, I think this is a great opportunity for these guys to feast, which then, as we said, helps the running backs and everything kind of works. So there's that. Deep backups. These are the guys where I think they could contribute. We're just kind of curious to see. I don't think you're going to see a lot of reps from them, but they could factor into it. Firstly, I'm going to put kind of a bracket around Jackson Benny. I don't know if he's going to factor much in this offense this year simply because they have guys that can do it, but he has potential to be able to get there. And he also has that speed to be able to get downfield. We saw it against Texas Tech where had Spencer Fano not gotten that penalty, the illegal man downfield penalty, Jackson's going for, what was that, like a 64-yard touchdown. He's got the ability to be able to do that. I just don't know that you need to utilize him as much this year as you did last year. Plus, he's going to be a main focus on the defense. Do you need your star guy being tired? But I'm going to put him in there still because I think he can be a component if you need him. Then there's incoming receiver from Mississippi State, Ricky Johnson. Didn't really have a lot of production last year, only had 3 catches. So really curious to see what he can do. Can he be a guy that can kind of factor in? Can he take the next step this year with Coach Bumpus and kind of have that connection, but then move forward and be kind of that next iteration for Utah as he grows and develops. He's a redshirt sophomore, so this isn't like he has to hit immediately, but I think, if you can get some production out of him and have some consistency, that only adds to your depth. Mana Carvalho, he's a guy that didn't get any, catches as a wide receiver last year, but he's got some speed. Obviously saw him as a returner, so you can see what he can do. Curious to see if they utilize him, right? Is he a jet sweep guy? Is he a slot guy that can kind of help Utah? What does his production look like? I still think, he's a little bit down the list in terms of being able to factor into the offensive side of the ball, but if he can make the necessary steps to get there, I think he's a shifty, capable guy that can help. But right now, I see him as more of a returner still and helping Utah in that way. And then there's redshirt freshman Bryson Baker. We just don't know yet, right? We'll see. And so I'm curious to see what can come of that for him, but just not any production yet to be able to evaluate. And, I think there's enough players ahead of him that, barring him having a breakout spring, I don't know that he's going to factor into that yet. But I know that there's belief that he can be factored into that. We'll just see. So that's your wide receivers. Like I said, I think this is a much better landing spot this year than last year. But with that said, we also thought Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons were going to be this guaranteed 1-2 pop. Ryan Davis is going to be your third option, and they could be effective. It changes, right? You don't really know what you have until you get out on the field. And even though a guy has produced in previous spots, maybe they have a different situation here at Utah, or vice versa, right? They didn't produce at another spot, and now they come here at Utah and they can produce. So we'll see. We'll see how this all looks, but I think there's a little bit more confidence going in this year than there was last year, and I think that alone helps you. But there's still questions there. We'll see what happens, and really curious to see what takes place. Now, lastly, we'll go with the tight ends. Tight ends, in my eyes, aren't going to be a huge focus of this offense, mostly because Kevin McGivern hasn't utilized them a ton. But talking to some people, that's mostly because he didn't have the type of tight ends that he needed to be able to utilize them. Number one, Utah has Hunter Andrews. And I understand he's a do-it-all Swiss Army knife type player. I don't think any of that's going to change, but he's still a tight end, and I think he can be kind of your odds-on favorite to be the guy. How he factors in and, coming off of an injury, what he can do remains to be seen. But this is a guy that only played 4 games last year, and, ton of promise for what he could be. He's, he doesn't drop the ball that often. He had good receiving grades, good offensive grades. Like, everything about him screamed off the page that he could be a really solid player. We just unfortunately didn't get to see him that long. I still think he's going to be a featured player in this offense as a pass catcher. And so I'm really fascinated to see what kind of steps that he can make, what Kevin McGivern can drop for him. Does he still utilize that Swiss Army knife type role, or do they have a set position for him? Do they flex him out a little bit more as a wide receiver? We'll see. I think he's a position where I don't know it matters. You can put him at fullback. You can put him in a whole host of positions, and he's going to find a way to be impactful in the game. So I don't think there's any worry of who he can be. It's just a matter of kind of finding his spot with this new offense and kind of working there. Then there's Noah Benny coming back to Utah from Weber State. He's kind of your in the dirt tight end, hand in the dirt tight end, really cementing what the offensive line can be. I think that's a really good opportunity for Utah to have him, but he also can be a pass catcher too. I see him as kind of like a Cole Fotheringham type tight end, where he can be efficient on the line, but also be a pass catcher needs be. But I think, he and Hunter Andrews are going to be 2 different types of players, but I think both can be effective in their own right. Curious to see if they utilize him in that role and create like a 6th lineman type thing, or if Kevin McGivern wants to operate in a different mindset. So we'll see. We'll see what happens there. And then obviously you get Semi Taulonga, the do-it-all. Is he a fullback? Is he a tight end? Whatever he is, I love it. And I think Utah, so long as he's not being a featured player on the defensive side of the ball, I think he's going to continue to get a ton of offensive reps because he can be efficient. He was good in the backfield and being able to serve as a pass blocker. He got 2 catches last year. It only went for 3 yards, but I can't wait for the time where they line him up in the backfield and let him run the rock, or they pass it out to him and he gets a touchdown. I'm waiting for those moments, but I still think he's going to be efficient and effective, and I think another year of development on the offensive side could really help his game and help Utah in what they want to do. So really excited about what he could be. I just love kind of the new iteration that teams are going with. We're having these bigger bodied guys, not quite the fullback, but still the fullback, kind of a tight end. It's just kind of this hybrid position that has been kind of fun to watch, and really curious to see what Semi can do with another year under the offense. And then as your backups, you've got Will Money coming in from Oklahoma State. He's a guy that had 3 catches last year, so still not a lot to know about him, but I think there's a lot of upside on what he can be. Does he factor into this a lot more? Where does he fit in? I'm curious there. You also have freshman Bear Fisher, and I'm curious to see what happens there as well as he develops into this. Do we start hearing his name in spring? Will it factor in fall? Really, really curious. But I think all in all, this offensive side of the ball has a lot of key components that should make it work moving into the next year. It'll look a little bit different. You're not going to have the same offensive line that is as stout as what Utah had last year, but I don't know it's going to be a huge drop-off, or at least I'm not expecting it to be a huge drop-off, but it remains to be seen, right? And I think we'll see how that unit works, especially in McGivens' offense, and what they can do and kind of what happens as a team. So that's our position breakdowns for the offensive front, offensive side of the ball, staff, whatever you want to call it. That's where it's at. We'll jump into more of this stuff next week with the defense. We'll get through some of that. This is where I think there's a lot more questions, and maybe not so much questions in terms of does Utah have the guys, more just questions on who's going to be starters. So we'll jump into that and kind of keep going down into this as we get closer to March. Next week, I will be in Kansas City for the Big 12 tournament for the women's side. So we'll see if I can get a podcast out. It may be a day earlier. We'll see what happens, but we'll try to get that out. So for now, if you haven't yet, go subscribe on YouTube at Utah Checkdown, and subscribe also wherever you get your podcasts. I really do appreciate it, and we will chat later. Have a great one.